All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are finally onto the topic of intensity. While I know each time I've kind of given some added almost importance to each new topic, I'll say when it comes to the basis and just core of powerlifting programming, intensity certainly falls into what I would say is the most important. There's a lot of facets to that, but I'd say simply put, it's the sport of powerlifting. If we aren't lifting heavy, we aren't powerlifters. And if we don't have the ability to lift heavy, we don't have the ability to be a successful powerlifter. So while sure, like volume and specificity and all these other things are very crucial, intensity is going to be one of the most main ideas and focal points of that specificity. And while sure, like volume's important and trying to be specific in a lot of ways is important when it comes to like what variations and how lifting, all that is very crucial. Intensity is going to always be an important thing to figure out in relation to our programming, just for the fact that it's going to be insanely individualistic, as well as it's going to always have I guess a bit of some sort of change. While sure, like you could argue that volume won't always be static, I'd say in a big, broad way, a lot of coaches' goals is to find that static level of volume. And that's once again kind of discussing it much more, if you guys watched the video last time, discussing it much more from just counting the actual amount of working sets per week or per day, and all that is going to be kind of how we're looking at it from. Sure, like if we look at it from maybe the idea of tonnage, then maybe sure there will be always small manipulations of volume as well, just from the ever-changing amounts of intensity. But if we're really reducing it down to, hey, we are tracking the amount of working sets we have per session, per week, per block, per macro cycle, then yes, volume's going to always be ideally a lot more static, just because once again, if we find that nice static volume for a lifter, it'll help us really find that sweet spot of when we are getting the best adaptations, but when we aren't increasing fatigue too much towards getting too much cumulative fatigue to end up seeing either a dip in performance or we end up seeing some sort of overuse injury. But with intensity, there's going to always be this kind of slow, steady change to it, once again, just to kind of keep up with the level of adaptations. Once again, our goal as a coach and as a lifter is to be constantly getting small adaptations to our training, and if we're not, then something's going very wrong. But if our level of adaptation is higher, that means the level to, once again, meet that new level of adaptation to help spur it on even more needs to be caught up to it. So if we just kind of keep doing the same static amount of intensity every week, whether it's through absolute or relative intensity, then we're kind of missing the mark. We're not helping spur on more adaptations. Obviously, this is a lot to be implied with the idea of, load management, making sure that we're not doing that every single week, because there will be times when we are looking for some sort of static RP, whether it's on a secondary or tertiary day or so on and so forth. But within the broad scheme of things, we are looking for some sort of constant improvement to be spurring on new adaptations, whether it's through trying to load a heavier weight at a less RPE, or just more bar speed, or through obviously more reps, more sets, more volume, or more load on the bar. But let's rewind here for a second. What is intensity? I just said those words, absolute and relative. So obviously there's two main types of intensity I think is referred to the most. And discussing first and foremost absolute intensity, I think that's kind of the more common thought of one. Really all it's referring to is just the amount of load on the bar. Literally, how heavy is it? I'd say even kind of more specifically how it's referred to is the actual specific amount that load is in comparison to our 1 rep max. So let's say like our, if we squat 500 pounds and we are doing a working set with 400 pounds, then we're therefore doing a working set with 80% of our 1 rep max. Just a little quick math there for you guys. So literally it's kind of looked at as most time as a percentage. So if we are programming to a percentage based off of our actual competition 1 rep max, that is when we are referring to the absolute intensity. On the flip side of that, if we look at relative intensity, as much more, if you've ever heard anybody say the word RPE, as I have several times already, that is much more, once again, that stands for rate of perceived exertion. That is referring to, once again, just how tough we perceive a set to be. Whether it's a set of 1 or a set of 5, there's going to always be some sort of attached RPE to it for a number of reasons. But say in this case, if we are programming something to an RPE instead of a percentage, that is where, once again, we are searching for a more of an absolute intensity. Kind of letting there be some sort of wiggle room to it, a little bit of leeway. Because once again, I'm sure all of us, our level of preparedness has been different at some point. So say if there's a day where, we have good days, or there's a day where we have bad days and we're not feeling as good. Obviously, a lot of that comes down to a lot of programming standards and a lot of programming just making sure it's being appropriately dosed. But obviously, there's going to always be external factors as well. Say if didn't sleep good the night before, kid kept you up, you're kind of sick, you have bad allergies, work's been kicking your butt, just whatever sort of external stressors can add to your system can obviously change the degree of strength we have the following day or within that session, or even can be a little bit more cumulative as well, to where we just might have a bit of a rougher block our whole training week as well. So I think that's why a lot of coaches are gravitating more towards that RPE, because there is that kind of flexibility within that. But at the end of the day, when it comes to trying to train and trying to become a better powerlifter, we are chasing that idea of adaptations. So I had that post recently discussing why we shouldn't be trying to just pursue this constantly high RPE and trying to just force more weight on the bar through absolute intensity, but to once again use that RPE as a good limiter to help us make sure that we are getting the best training stimulus possible every single time. Because if we know that if we figure out an athlete, whether it's through heuristically or just through their own data, their training data, hey, they do the best when we keep them between a 6 and 7.5 RPE. If you kind of abide by that and kind of progressively overload within that range, that's where we'll see the best progress from them. So it's like, why would we go out of our way to program them based off of absolute intensity and trying to force, like saying, hey, I want them to be able to squat 585 pounds. So like, I'm just going to program them to where they squat 5 more pounds every single week until they get there. Obviously, there's going to be a big crash and burn there, and there's going to be hitting a big wall for the vast majority of athletes. And obviously, there isn't going to always be a case for using more relative intensity and trying to use RPE for everybody. There will always be good times to use a just more traditional absolute intensity programming up percentage, or just assigning a load based off of that. Obviously, if somebody's a lot more, say if somebody's a lot more novice, they're seeing a very rapid rate of progressions, or say obviously they're novice and they can't determine that RPE very well, there'll be very appropriate times for that. But say even, once again, I have some people that I just cannot trust with an RPE. I know that they will always overshoot it, even whether they know it or not, whether it's subconscious or conscious. I know that they will always overshoot it, and there will be some sort of a wall hit in the program. But I'd say a lot of coaches end up looking at, not a lot, but some coaches end up looking at RPEs being, I guess, in a way lazy from another coach's standpoint, thinking, oh, good luck, go hit a 6 RPE single, you figured it out, and then hit a 4x8 after. Not trying to throw shade at any specific coach, but I think some people look at it as lazy, and it very well could be. But I think a lot of good coaches, they will properly use just some sort of an actual RPE range. Like I use this chart I got from Steve at PR's Performance. I think he has even mentioned that he's gotten it from elsewhere, but just it's a nice little chart that us coaches share just to kind of help identify what that proper RPE should be. So say if I'm prescribing an RPE, obviously I know in my head that I'm adding leeway to that there's going to be some wiggle room. So say if I have somebody, I'm wanting them to hit a top set at a 6 to 6.5 RPE, then I'll give them a range based off that. But I will use this chart to say, hey, this percentage of a set of 4, for instance, I know that this needs to be between this percentage and this percentage to be between a 6 and a 6.5 RPE. So I will basically use just a simple calculator, heaven forbid, to actually help pick those numbers, saying, hey, your top set of 4 today is going to be between, say, 102.5 kilos and 112.5 kilos. Just make sure you warm up appropriately, find what's best for there. Then I'll have them punch that in a program, and we'll have some very good percentage-based backdowns from there, making sure that the percentages they are hitting that day are as accurate as possible as well, based off of what they perceive that top set to be. So let's actually bring all this around to some sort of a head, if you will, so that way we can actually find some sort of tangible use out of all this, and kind of where I take my stance on intensity. Well, obviously our goal is to always have the most ideal amount of intensity to make sure that we are spurring and getting the best training stimulus possible. Because kind of how I break it down the other day is that intensity is the actual specific type of stimulus, while the volume is the degree or the amount of the stimulus that we are getting from that as well. So obviously, while a lot of things, I showed that heuristic chart last time on how to help determine the best volume for each individual athlete, and then once again see how that goes, look at the data, what kind of adjustments can you make. But for intensity, once again, it's much more trying to find out what's that proper stimulus that each athlete needs to spur on that best adaptation possible to make them the best powerlifter possible. So here's where I really take on the stance of it, and that I so much gravitate towards trying to shoot for a much lower RPE for the majority of my lifters. And I know it kind of sounds counterintuitive after we've discussed so much about specificity and why we need to lift heavy to be able to be a successful powerlifter, but that doesn't mean that we're not lifting heavy if we're aiming for a relatively lower RPE. Because once again, there's kind of several ideas to the thought of specificity. The best way that I've thought about it and the best way I've seen it put personally is that obviously we're trying to appease the idea of maximal force production as well. So if we are hitting a lot of higher RPE sets that are making us get so fatigued that our ability to have less force production is less, then we're technically training at less specificity in that realm as well. And I iterated this in an Instagram post a couple months ago or a month ago. I'm discussing how this isn't by any means me discussing speed work, because once again, I'd say it's the farthest thing away from being specific as we can possibly be when it comes to intensity. It's trying to find, hey, where can we lift as heavy as we possibly can while maintaining a high force production? That way, once again, these sets and reps that we're performing with that high force production, but being as heavy as possible, is going to once again be as specific as we can. Because what we are doing on the platform, where it's a 9.5, 10 RPE, is depending on us having that highest force production value, that highest force production possible. So if we're training high rep sets, say if we're doing like a set of 5 and it ends up being like a 10 RPE, meaning that we cannot do any more, obviously the first 2 reps of that set of 5 are going to have a significantly higher level of force production than 3, 4, and 5, and it's just going to keep diminishing as the set goes along. So technically, the first 2 reps of that set are going to have a more specific training stimulus than the last 3 will. So this is why you'll see a lot of the very best in the world, that there will be so many times where they're doing a very easy session at a 4, at a 5, at a 6 RPE, or sometimes even less. You'll see some people, they are legitimately doing a skill-based day where they're doing just a RPE 2 set of deadlift. Just once again, make sure that, hey, we're greasing the wheel, we're getting some skill work, but we're not doing nearly enough to carry over any fatigue into our next deadlift day or any other training day. But even once again, when it comes to the technical RPE, and if we're kind of using that as a reps and reserve type of system, that's going to be severely individualized for each athlete. I have some athletes, their speed does not drop off till they start hitting a 9 RPE. But I have some athletes, their speed will drop off heavily at a 6 RPE. So that's kind of where I use that nice little almost just perceiving the speed of the bar comparative to their RPE. And once again, you got to kind of learn how true these RPEs are with your athletes by being able to test it every now and then. That's why we can't just train easy all the time, or I even hate calling this training easy. It's just training as intelligently as possible to make sure that we are getting the best adaptations possible to get as strong as possible. But it's trying to find where that lies with each of your athletes. So I'd say the easiest way to approach that is be okay programming them at a relatively lower RPE and letting that kind of progress and seeing where they start seeing the best adaptations and where that speed starts to drop off block after block. So if I see with one guy that, like I have Nick that I actually use in that post, his bench RPE his bench speed really does not drop off until he hits a 9 RPE. Like he will hit a 6 RPE or a 5 RPE just as fast as he hits an 8.5. So we are able with his bench, he's the highest intensity bencher I have. We can kind of keep him in this really weird like 7.5 to 9 pocket to where he will just progress like crazy within there. And we'll kind of use a secondary and tertiary day for just maybe a skill touch, or we'll use a secondary day even just as like a volume accumulation day, so that we're not just beating him up on this one day. And after being with him for almost a year and a half, we found this perfect little system to where his bench is moving way better than it ever has, even with him being a bit more experienced. But on the other end of that, I displayed Chris in that last Instagram post showing how we keep him literally what he calls RPE 6 lane, and he at first hated it, but we immediately added on probably 70 pounds onto his squat after probably 2 blocks of just trying to keep him at a much more appropriate RPE, to where we were getting the same level of adaptations that he always ever was from his RPE 7 and 8 work, but now we just have so much less cumulative fatigue to where we just kind of get to display his strength better. But even just with us being able to display his strength better, that allows us to train more effectively and even heavier within that RPE range as well, meaning that once again the progress comes around to being much faster. And once again, I'll iterate this again as I did in that Instagram post. This is not me saying to train easy all the time or to just kind of mail it in and say, hey, I just need to go hit an RPE 5 single and I'm doing everything possible. That is not the case. Obviously, there's going to be a level of mental fortitude that comes with trying to hit a heavy set of squats, bench, or deadlift, and trying to be actually mentally ready for that on a platform. That's why, once again, whenever the time is right, use your knowledge, use your coach. Just have planned times to where you will hit those RPE 9s, hit those heavy sets to have that mental awareness and just have that exposure. Or once again, even use the idea of just a self-limiting variation or anything along those lines of we're trying to have some sort of movement constraint to help us really guide us to, hey, we can hit some higher RPEs, but the load on the bar is going to be significantly less. Say comparing like a Larson bench press to your competition bench press or a pause deadlift to your normal deadlift. And just how those variations can help us overall lift less load at a higher RPE, therefore kind of, once again, giving us just as good of a stimulus, but even just kind of helping us carry less fatigue all the time. But even on top of that, do not mail in your actual accessories. Use those accessories to go to that 8, 9, 9.5 RPE. So again, that's going to be where it's the opposite. Well, I look at strength training as where we're getting the most specific type of work with our actual barbell work, being that, hey, we have high force production, but with the heaviest weight possible. While on the opposite end, I look at hypertrophy work and our accessory work being, hey, we want it to be as challenging as possible, if that means with not even with the most amount of load all the time. Because say if we can get that much more of a hypertrophy benefit to have that much more strength potential, that's where we got to have that high RPE. So to summarize that, make sure your barbell work for the majority of the time. Make sure you're able to blast the crap out of it. Find those RPEs. Find what RPEs and what kind of levels that bar speed drops off at what RPE. And rinse and repeat in that range. Find that little sweet spot. Progress within there and increase that baseline. And before you know it, you'll add pounds and pounds and pounds onto your lifts and onto your total without having near as much fatigue drop off to where we're going to have, more skill drop off from fatigue, or being way less likely for injury in the long run. But then with the hypertrophy work and the accessories, go balls to the wall. Have fun there. Use those to increase your mental fortitude. Use those to increase your muscle tissue. Use those to increase your strength potential. So honestly, guys, this is going to kind of wrap up my actual programming basics little series. I just want to make it 3 little parts discussing what I feel like is the 3 cornerstones of powerlifting programming. So I'm going to kind of move on to some more movement type stuff. I feel like that lately I've gotten a little bit more on my high horse on just some of these funny ideas within the powerlifting industry of how certain muscles do things that they aren't actually doing. So I'm going to jump into a little series on that next. But if you guys have any questions or any suggestions on what you'd like to learn about, please let me know.